Good evening. We begin tonight with breaking news. As of this morning, March 16th, 2026, the President of the United States has personally contacted 7 allied nations, urgently requesting they deploy warships to the Strait of Hormuz. The response? A stunning and unanimous rejection. Each and every one of those allies said no, publicly and on the record. President Trump first took to Truth Social, calling on China, France, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and others to send their navies. Met with silence, he then warned the Financial Times that a refusal would be, in his words, very bad for the future of NATO. When that threat also failed to move the needle, the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz, went on television, escalating the rhetoric dramatically. He said, quote, "The United States welcomes, encourages, and even demands allied participation. Let's be clear, that is not the language of a partner requesting help. It is the language of a government that has run out of options." Then came the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, telling reporters these nations should contribute because they are, and this is her exact phrase, benefiting enormously from the United States military removing the threat of Iran. The translation is blunt. We started this war alone. We need you to treat it like a shared victory, and we need you to send your ships to the firing line to prove it. Not a single country said yes. And the rejections didn't stop with the 7 nations on the president's call list. Germany, Greece, Italy, and Spain all publicly declined without even being asked. Tonight, we need to break down why every single one of America's allies is rejecting this call for help, what that tells us about where this dangerous conflict is headed, and how Iran is strategically using its control of the strait to pull those very allies away from Washington and closer to Tehran. Here's what we know right now. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, held a press conference just this morning, stating unequivocally, quote, "We will not be dragged into a wider war." He added, "This was never envisioned as a NATO mission." President Trump's reaction was swift and deeply personal. He mocked the Prime Minister for saying he needed to consult with his team before making a decision. The President's direct quote, "You don't need to meet with your team. You are the Prime Minister." That is a sitting American president publicly ridiculing the leader of America's closest ally for following a basic democratic process. In Germany, the response was just as blunt. Defense Minister Boris Pistorius delivered a 7-word rejection that carries more weight than any policy paper. "This is not our war. We did not start it." And Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul added that Berlin expects Washington and Tel Aviv to, quote, "inform us, include us, and tell us when their objectives are achieved." That is not the language of a hesitant ally. It is the language of a government demanding to be treated as something other than a cleanup crew. France was ambiguous, but its refusal was clear in practice. President Macron referenced a possible future mission when circumstances permit. The circumstance he appears to be waiting for is the end of the war, meaning he has agreed to nothing while the fighting is actually happening. Canada refused. Australia's Transport Minister Catherine King said the U.S. has not even formally requested support and that Canberra is not prepared to offer it. Japan said it is reviewing its options but has no plans to send ships. Greece said no. Italy's foreign minister insisted diplomacy must prevail. And Spain's defense minister, Margarita Robles, delivered what might be the most forceful rejection of all, saying, quote, "Spain will never accept any provisional measures because the objective must be for the war to end and to end now." And then the European Union itself weighed in collectively. Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas gathered EU foreign ministers in Brussels to forge a unified response. Her conclusion afterward was stark. There is, quote, "no appetite to extend the EU's existing naval mission toward Hormuz." She added, "No one wants to actively go into this war." The bottom line tonight, 0 countries have committed forces. That is the situation as of this afternoon. But this wave of rejection is only half the picture. We need to understand why each of these nations calculated that refusing the United States was their safest bet. And we need to examine the Iranian strategy that is quietly pulling U.S. allies away from Washington faster than any American threat could. Now, many believe this is simply about political disagreement, European leaders posturing for their voters, avoiding risk. But the reality is structural. The refusal follows a logic so consistent across a dozen world capitals that it reveals something broken in the very foundation of the Western alliance system. Each nation that said no arrived at that answer through its own internal debate, but they all reached the same conclusion. And the reasons converge into a pattern that the White House either doesn't see or perhaps cannot afford to acknowledge. The first and most profound reason: consultations, or rather, the total lack of them. In the days before February 28th, President Trump reportedly told Gulf Arab allies the entire operation would be over in 4 days with a total Iranian capitulation. Just last weekend, his top economic advisor, Kevin Hassett, repeated a 4 to 6 week timeline on the Sunday shows, insisting the administration was ahead of schedule. But that timeline has already been contradicted by Israel's own military, which announced this week the war will last at least 3 more weeks, with thousands of targets remaining. Operation Epic Fury began on February 28th. What is now crystal clear is that key allies feel they were never given sufficient clarity on American war aims, timelines, or an exit strategy. That frustration has boiled over publicly in Europe, where officials repeatedly asked Washington to explain its strategic objectives. As Estonia's foreign minister, Margus Tsahkna, put it simply, what will be the plan? The Wall Street Journal reported this week that the administration planned to announce a convoy coalition as soon as today, but buried deep in that same report was a detail that unravels the entire plan. The nations involved are still debating whether operations would begin before or after a ceasefire. Think about that. If the coalition only activates after the fighting ends, it's not a wartime alliance, it's a cleanup crew disguised as a show of force. The second reason is the relationship itself. For years, President Trump targeted these same allies with tariffs, threats of withdrawal, public insults, and ultimatums over NATO funding. He pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, called the alliance obsolete, imposed trade penalties on European steel and aluminum, and ridiculed leaders like Macron, Merkel, and Trudeau on the world stage. Now, the first time he genuinely needs their military cooperation, he isn't asking, he's threatening. He told the Financial Times that NATO faces a very bad future if countries don't comply. He told reporters, "We will remember." This isn't coalition building, it's coercion from a position of weakness, and every government on that call list recognizes it. The third reason is domestic politics. European voters are overwhelmingly hostile to this conflict. Energy prices on the continent were already painful after the war in Ukraine. Now Brent crude has surged above $100 a barrel. Gasoline prices are rising in every EU member state. Natural gas is spiking because the liquefied natural gas from Qatar, which Europe has heavily relied on since cutting off Russian supply, transits through the very strait that is now effectively sealed. Any European leader who sends warships to the Persian Gulf alongside the US Navy is effectively ending their own political career. Robles in Madrid understood this. Pistorius in Berlin understood this. Starmer in London understood this. The fourth reason goes even deeper, and it's infuriating officials in Brussels. This war is directly enriching Russia. Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas said it publicly. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz is funneling revenue directly to Moscow's war machine, because every dollar that oil rises above $70 is another dollar funding Russia's campaign in Ukraine. And here is the part that is most galling to European leaders. The United States is simultaneously granting sanctions waivers that allow India and other nations to buy Russian crude already at sea. NATO's primary strategic concern is Russia. The war President Trump is fighting against Iran is funding the very adversary NATO exists to confront. He is asking European capitals to send destroyers to the Gulf while his own Treasury Department greenlights Russian oil sales. The contradiction is not subtle. It is official U.S. policy. Now let's talk about geography, because even if the political will existed, the military problem is severe. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point, and Iran controls the mountainous northern shore. Tehran has spent decades preparing to threaten shipping there with mines, missiles, drones, and swarms of fast attack craft. The U.S. military has already announced it destroyed 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels near the strait, which shows just how quickly any escort mission could escalate into a direct shooting war. Naval experts are warning that safely reopening Hormuz while active hostilities continue would be extremely difficult, even for the most advanced Western navies. And there is a recent precedent that no defense ministry has forgotten: the Red Sea. The Houthi disruption was a smaller-scale preview of this exact scenario. A non-state militia with a fraction of Iran's capabilities shut down one of the busiest shipping corridors on Earth. 2 U.S. administrations launched strikes. President Biden admitted the strikes weren't working and continued them anyway. President Trump did the same and eventually walked away. The Red Sea was never fully secured. Every allied military strategist drew one chilling conclusion from that episode: if the full power of the U.S., Navy could not reopen the Red Sea against the Houthis. No makeshift coalition is going to hold the Strait of Hormuz against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, deploying ballistic anti-ship missiles, fast attack craft, submarines, and a hardened coastal missile network built over 4 decades for exactly this confrontation. And now for the part that matters most. The part most of the coverage has missed entirely. Iran is not just blockading the strait. Iran is using the strait as a diplomatic sorting mechanism. Foreign Minister Araghchi said it plainly on CBS. The Strait of Hormuz is open. It is only closed to American, Israeli, and allied vessels. The others are free to pass. And then Tehran proved it. A Pakistani-flagged tanker named Karachi transited the strait on March 16th, carrying crude from Abu Dhabi. 2 Indian gas carriers passed safely. A Turkish vessel received clearance from Iran. China is in direct negotiations with Iran to guarantee passage for its oil and for Qatar's gas shipments. And we are now learning that France and the UK have reportedly opened their own back-channel talks with Tehran about securing their vessels. Follow that logic to its stunning conclusion. Every allied capital now faces a choice. Join a U.S. convoy mission and guarantee that Iran classifies your ships as hostile targets, or negotiate directly with Tehran, stay out of the war, and keep your oil flowing. Washington is offering its partners the privilege of becoming combatants. Iran is offering them the privilege of becoming customers. For any government making that calculation, the answer is obvious. This is the strategic maneuver the administration seems to have never anticipated. Iran has turned the strait from a military choke point into a diplomatic lever that is actively prying allies away from American leadership. Every nation that negotiates with Tehran for safe passage is implicitly acknowledging Iranian authority over that waterway. Every successful transit arranged through Iranian channels is a quiet rejection of American power. The alliance is not just failing to assemble, it is being dismantled from the outside by the very adversary this war was supposed to eliminate. And the economic architecture underneath all of this is collapsing in parallel. Before the war, 138 ships transited the strait daily. As of this week, the UK Maritime Trade Operations reports no more than 5. Oil exports through the waterway have fallen below 10% of pre-conflict levels. According to the IEA, Brent crude is trading between $102 and $116 per barrel. It touched $120 last week. The IEA announced on March 11th the largest emergency reserve release in its 52-year history, 400 million barrels across 32 nations. The U.S. alone is contributing 172 million barrels from a strategic petroleum reserve that only contains 415 million. That is 41% of America's entire emergency reserve, and the release has not stabilized prices. Crude rose 17% in the days after the announcement. Production from southern Iraq's oil fields has collapsed by 70%, falling from 4.3 million barrels per day to just 1.3 million. Kuwait has announced preemptive production cuts. Saudi Arabia is rerouting what it can through its east-west pipeline to the Red Sea, but that pipeline was never built to replace the strait. The global shortfall stands at roughly 12 million barrels per day, and no combination of reserves, pipelines, and alternate routes can close that gap. And it's not just oil. The global supply of liquefied natural gas has been cut by 20% because Qatar, a major exporter, ships through that same choke point. That directly undermines Europe's effort to replace Russian gas. Shipments of fertilizer, helium, and uranium are also at a standstill. China has already tapped its strategic fertilizer reserve. The United States has none. Meanwhile, the wider global picture continues to fracture. North Korea launched multiple ballistic missiles into the sea 2 days ago during U.S.-South Korea military exercises, adding to the instability in East Asia. China has increased military activity around Taiwan. PLA headquarters is reportedly monitoring this conflict on live screens, tracking missile trajectories and strike patterns in real time. They are not intervening, they are studying. Dubai International Airport, one of the busiest aviation hubs on the planet, was hit today by a drone that struck a fuel depot, forcing a temporary suspension of all operations. Commercial flights bound for Dubai turned around in midair. Qatar intercepted a second wave of Iranian missiles this morning. Kuwait's airport remains closed. Abu Dhabi is operating at limited capacity. And in a sign of just how high the stakes are, David Sachs, an advisor to the Trump administration, publicly warned of the risk of nuclear escalation. That comment stood out, bringing a taboo scenario into open discussion, even as officials remain guarded about how they publicly speak of Israel's capabilities. So let's put the full picture together tonight. The assumption before February 28th. A 4-day war, total Iranian capitulation, the strait remains open, and allies fall in line. The reality in week 3. The strait is under Iranian control, oil is over $100 a barrel, the largest reserve release in history is failing to hold down prices, and we have a unanimous, public, on-the-record rejection from every single allied capital Washington contacted. The assumption was regime collapse. The reality is the slain Supreme Leader's son took power within 72 hours and declared the strait will remain sealed as leverage. The assumption was that a coalition forms quickly, escorts begin, and global trade resumes. The reality, not one nation has committed a single warship, and several are now negotiating directly with Tehran for the very access Washington promised its coalition would provide. But the assumptions on Iran's side also deserve scrutiny. Tehran framed its closure of the strait as total. The reality is selective, with passage granted to nations willing to deal bilaterally. That is not a blockade born of strength. It is a calculated gamble that depends on the war not escalating to the point where Iran's own coastline becomes the front. If the administration moves toward a ground seizure of Karg Island, which handles 90% of Iran's crude exports, Tehran's leverage evaporates. Iran's bet requires that the escalation does not reach that threshold. Whether that bet holds is the question neither side can answer tonight. And the only question that remains is whether the next phase of this conflict will be decided by Washington, by Tehran, or by the dozen allied governments that just told the most powerful military on Earth that it is on its own.